So the log line for this film might be read as something like this. A dog wants to make dinner for his owner, despite his owner's sleep-deprived actions getting in the way. It's simple, it's kind of basic, it's probably not the best one that you could come up with. But it's kind of identifies all those major points that we want out of a good log line, right? We're trying to set a protagonist, right, which is the dog. We're establishing a setting, right? So he's cooking dinner, so it's obviously at a kitchen. Um, we have a problem or a goal that the protagonist is trying to accomplish. And so in this case, it's making dinner for his owner. And then we have a conflict, or we have to find that major conflict between the protagonist and their goal, like what's getting in the way. In this case, it is his owner's own sleep deprivation kind of interfering, and also the character not wanting to be discovered doing these human actions. So, what makes this short film unique, or something that stands out from the other films? Probably the most obvious aspect that you'll notice in this short film is the fact that it's being told from the point of view of the dog. There's a lot of a lot of short films and movies out there told from the point of view of animals and pets and dogs, right? But it provides that unique storytelling experience in this case because we are having this Toy Story experience where we're privy to the animal or thing that's supposed to be non-sentient or non-human doing human things or human-like things. And so in this case, this dog character is going around trying to pretend that he is just a normal pet dog, but he's going around, cooking dinner for his owner, which, provides the comedic uh, aspects to the film that makes it so memorable and enjoyable. So let's take out one more example. In this case, it's scrambled by Polder Animation. So please go ahead and pause here and watch the video. And the link should be listed below, and then come back. In this case, we have two characters who could be argued as being the primary protagonist, right? We have the girl and the Rubik's Cube, and at the various points of the film, we're kind of seeing events unfold from their point of view. We're empathizing with their journey and what they're trying to accomplish. So what's their conflict? So first we should figure out what their goal is. In this case, the girl doesn't have a super well-defined goal. She's waiting for a train. The train obviously has a set schedule, so really she's just kind of killing boredom at first. Later on, she has a goal of trying to solve the Rubik's Cube, right? She has this puzzle. It's obvious she enjoys visual puzzles, and so she wants to solve it. The Rubik's Cube wants her to have that revelatory moment of solving him. He obviously finds enjoyment in helping people make that connection and have that revelation when they solve him. So what's getting in their way? In this case, the main character, the girl, is preventing her from accomplishing that goal that both of them want, right? So she wants to solve the puzzle, but she gets easily frustrated and gives up. And the Rubik's Cube wants her to also solve it, but he's struggling with her, giving up so easily. He wants her to kind of have that patience, break it down in a slower manner, right? So the logline for this short film might be something like a bored and impatient young woman is waiting for a train where she encounters a sentient Rubik's Cube who wants her to solve him. Again, we go back to what the logline is trying to do and what it's trying to identify in our main elements of our story, breaking it down to its fundamentals. In this case, identifying who the protagonists are and the major characters, in this case, Rubik's Cube and the girl. We're identifying the goal, what they want. So in this case, the Rubik's Cube wants her to solve him, and ostensibly she wants to solve him too. And the conflict is her being bored and impatient, right? So we don't have to explicitly write it all out, but it creates that formula for what our main plot is going to be and helps us focus on those details when we're telling the story. So in this case, what makes the story unique or unusual is the presence of this magical Rubik's Cube that we see part of the film through the eyes of, right? So encountering sentient objects or sentient characters is not something new. What is something new about this is it's a using an object that we're not used to seeing as sentient, and he's trying to encourage her to make a certain personal growth in terms of her critical thinking and patience, right? So he's trying to teach her a lesson by using himself as a tool for learning. The underlying formula for the story is pretty familiar, right? We have a story of personal growth where at the beginning of the film, the character's in one state of their personality or their character, and at the end of the film, they've learned something new or they've developed themselves. And so in this case, the character first tries to solve the Rubik's Cube, she gets impatient, she gives up, she thinks it's stupid because she can't get it right away. And then through the rest of the film, she's trying to she learns the lesson of perseverance and an aspect of critical visual thinking, and so that taking that original formula or archetype that is so satisfying and then giving it that unique twist of having a magical Rubik's Cube is what makes this something that is both satisfying to watch and unique and fresh. I want to make an acknowledgement of not all short films and stories and projects people create are really narrative based. They don't have to have really clear storylines and character driven stories, right? There's a lot of short films out there that succeed despite having really vague stories or not really having a story at all and just being kind of like a visual short showcase. Most of these rely on visual work or a visual style to create atmosphere or spectacle, so something that is awesome to look at, right? And so it relies much more heavily on just being a really impressive piece. So while they're great films, they're not always the best story exercises. So if your purpose is to tell a story and create a interesting and lasting story, um, you might be better going a different route, so a more traditional storytelling route, to get the experience of creating and telling a story. I have some examples of just what these might be, so please watch these to get an idea of how they might not be traditional storytelling exercises. They still both have stories to them, especially Beat. I think Beat has a much more traditional story to it, but the purpose of the film is really more about the visuals and the experience. So typically, I steer students away from these approaches in my classes where they're making short films, making just a purely visual or um, audio experience, and have them try to focus more on like the standard story structures, not necessarily telling a standard story, but the process of creating a typical narrative project. Because in my opinion, if you don't nail the visuals and the style and the execution, then especially in the technical components, then the entire project just kind of falls apart by the end, right? You had an idea of something really funky and unique, but if you didn't put the time and effort early on and the visuals aren't good enough, then nobody's going to watch it. Sometimes a story or a really satisfying story, you still get something really satisfying out of it. So I wanted to give you guys a few brainstorming ideas that you could use when you guys are working together or working by yourselves to come up with a story idea. The first would be to set limitations on yourselves. So I think this is actually pretty beneficial, starting from nothing. So just starting from like you can make a story out of anything. You could make a story that goes anywhere or features any type of character. Um, Seems like it gives you a lot of freedom, but at the same time, I think it actually makes it more difficult to start from somewhere. So the idea of setting a limitation, like what type of character you're working with, what type of time period you're working with, even what type of technical components you want in your film, like we want two characters with character rigs, can actually give you great starting points for generating new story ideas, right? It gives you something to work with, and you'd be like, oh, okay, if we're only working with, only want to work with half a character, we know we can do this type of character, or we can set up our environment like this, and it can give you some really interesting ideas. When you're working with yourself and with other people, and you're generating ideas at the very beginning, it's a good idea to just write down everything. Everybody's ideas. Don't think somebody on your team is like, the story person and everybody else just has to do what they say. At the beginning, especially because you want to be open to all possible ideas. So just don't criticize each other. Don't put down any ideas or think they're stupid, especially for yourself as well. And just get down whatever you think might be interesting and get them all up on the wall. Vary the method of how you guys are coming up with stories. There's a lot of different ways you guys can just kind of, again, like setting limitations, generating a starting point for something interesting or unique or something you didn't think about before. So using things like random word generators or some kind of free word association can just create interesting combinations that might spark something interesting in your brain. Put it all up on a wall, so write it on post-it notes on a wall, or probably more realistically for you guys is putting it on a website, like a website that I use is Miro.com. So this might look a little overwhelming at first, but essentially what Miro.com is it's a collaborative mood board place. So you guys can drop in sketches, you guys can drop in post-it notes and write notes. You guys can write down your note ideas and attach inspiration or references to them. So it's a great visual brainstorming tool for anybody who is working on a team and is coming up with design ideas and trying to work together. So go for lots of ideas. Don't settle for your first ideas. This is true for all design processes, is the first idea that you have is rarely the best idea, or the first design you create is rarely the best design. Usually you want to keep going and exhaust as much as you can so that you have a wealth of options to choose from. And you usually go for the obvious at first, right? The first things you think of are going to be the first obvious story ideas or designs that you can come up with. And when you keep going further than that, you take it to the next step or iterate further and further, you start to get into the interesting areas, the areas that are unexpected because you didn't think of them at first, right? And if you didn't think about them at first, then other people probably didn't think about them at first either. And that's where you can surprise people and make something unique. And then when you're brainstorming for stories, especially with a team and partners, don't go too long. Break this down to like a 1 hour max activity and take a break if you need to, and then come back. It's brainstorming. It seems like a really kind of relaxed atmosphere, but for writers and anybody who's done any type of thinking in this sort of way, it takes a lot of mental energy, and so just make sure you guys are fresh and get away from it and then come back to it. I'd also recommend something that I didn't put on this list is look at a lot of references. There's tons of great short films out there, tons of great student projects out there, and while you don't want to be too influenced by others that have come before you, like you don't want to just copy what other people do and limit your own creativity, it can actually open up ideas that you didn't think you had, right? So, oh, I didn't think we could tell a film with a flip book animation incorporated into it or something like that, right? But if you watch all the other films out there, you can find a passion for something new that you want to do. I want to skip through these next slides pretty quickly. There are a lot of information that we've already kind of gone over, or just reiterations of the same points that we've made before. So setting limitations and rules within your world or space allows you to create a unique feeling to your film and experience when people are watching it. And this isn't just the story limitations of setting like, okay, we're going to make a film about underwater. This is more about creating rules within your world, within your story, and within your universe of how that world works, counter to how it works in the real world, right? So a good example of this would be the Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons. They had simple rules within that world that are essentially like laws of physics that can't be broken. And they worked with that, and that made a unique viewing experience that made that film or that show different, right? So, for example, Roadrunner never leaves the road. Roadrunner can't hurt Wile E. Coyote except for by just, going meep meep. The coyote's clever traps will always backfire on him, right? Which is the source of much of the humor of the cartoon. Wherever possible, make gravity the coyote's greatest enemy. And the coyote is always more humiliated than harmed by his failures. So there's a lot of intention behind these of why they did this, right? So for instance, the last one, coyote is always more humiliated than harmed, means that it's not like a spiteful show. It's not a show that you watch and you feel uncomfortable with, like, oh, I don't know if I should be laughing at this. But it also, these design limitations that they set on themselves within the world really makes it unique and one of a kind. When you're brainstorming, this is a great approach for coming up with unique ideas, kind of like using like a random word generator. It's something that can help you kind of pair up ideas you didn't think of pairing up before, and also lets you identify those core story elements that we had talked about. When you're brainstorming and coming up with new ideas, the shopping list approach can actually be really helpful. This is a great tool for starting to like scramble together ideas and kind of bringing together different elements that you wouldn't really have thought of in the first place and seeing what surprises you and latching onto those. And it also helps you identify the elements of building a basic story structure, like identifying the character, setting, what their situation they're in and what their conflict is, and then making sure that you're actually working with that structure so that you have a satisfying kind of story for your team. So in these different categories, you can brainstorm how to make that specific element of your story unique, right? So coming up with a character, let's say for this first example, you might say police officer, right? We're going to have something about trying to keep, a city safe or protecting people, right? So our main character is going to be a police officer, all right? And then you can think, how could we make that a unique character, right? So let's make it an animal, or let's make it, a microscopic police officer. And by kind of identifying these different elements and making them unique or different, it can actually inspire you to change any of your other elements to match that in a unique way, right? So if you identified that, oh, we want to tell a story about a police officer stopping a robbery or stopping a dangerous bad guy, right? And we decide, oh, what if our police officer was microscopic? Okay, then where would they be? They would be inside a city in the human body. Okay, then what would they be trying to keep safe? Oh, something of the human body, right? They're like a antibody or trying to help keep the like a white blood cell or something like that, trying to keep the body safe, right? And then we can identify what a unique conflict would be to a microscopic police officer. So by having these categories and starting to fill them out and then mixing them up a bit and thinking of something unique, it can actually inspire you to come up with some really cool ideas for the other components of that story and really find some unique creativity here. So I think again, it's a good idea to try to exhaust different possibilities and just keep going and thinking of new areas and new characters, new conflicts for each of these categories so that you can really find something different and find something that might inspire you. So just keep going with this and come up with a list. So for instance, with the characters, is it an animal, plant, or mineral? Is it a talking mug of coffee, a mime, a doodle in a notebook, right? So these are all pretty different and unique, and things like a talking mug of coffee or a doodle in a notebook, those aren't the things you first go for, right? Those are things that you wouldn't reach until you kind of sat down and thought about it and kind of started, iterating on these, like, who could our character be? Who do we want to see as a new, unique point of view from? For settings, you can do something like inside of a refrigerator in a particular country, on the back of a dog, right? If you did that, like, what would that be? Would that be a flea? Are we a flea on the back of a dog? Inside of a sock drawer, are we a unpaired sock that is looking for its partner? Under the bed, are we a monster that's waiting underneath the bed, or are we an abandoned toy from a kid's, early childhood? On the moon, under the ocean, in ancient Japan, inside of a video game, right? So it's not just literally like we're in the kitchen, we're in the bedroom, we're in the front yard, right? The setting can be something that inspires everything else and creates a really unique experience for the viewer. Situations and occupations are a great place to look for figuring out what the goal and eventually the conflict is going to be, right? So just creating an occupation like a police officer or a situation like a wedding, right? Creates all these opportunities for where something can go wrong or where someone's goals can be potentially thwarted, right? So here's just some examples. We can have a birthday party. Someone's maybe trying to maybe nobody comes up to this kid's birthday, right? And it's just kind of sad, and the parents try to make the birthday better for the kid, right? We have a wedding, which someone's trying to interrupt, and when they say, if anybody has any objections, the person says, I object. We have funerals, right? Which might be an unexpected place to have a short story in, especially if you're going for something that's humorous. A jailbreak, right? Just full of tension and a lot of opportunities for drama. Alien abductions, trips to the dentist, a preparation of a meal, right? Like Omelet, the short story we watched a little bit ago. A school dance. I already said a wedding. Thieves, shepherds, even occupations like thieves and shepherds or police officers, just thinking about that, can give you a lot of new ideas of how a person might have a different goal than what we're used to in everyday life. And so finally, we need to figure out what the conflict is. And I think in this case, if I was doing this brainstorming activity, I would try to brainstorm and play around with the characters, settings, situations, occupations to find the most unique sort of scenario to tell a story in, which can give rise to unique conflicts, right? Because those conflicts are often determined by who the character is and what situations or places they're put into. So when you think about the conflict, you can think of what kind of weakness does this character have, right? A thief, for instance, is going to have the weakness of wanting to steal something that's really valuable or dangerous to steal, right? A shepherd is going to be trying to protect their flock and, is going to be constantly paranoid and looking over their flock. Does their parents approve of what they're doing? Is one character in danger? Are they in search for something? So thinking of these just different elements of their backstory and their life, and what the situation calls for can give you a lot of unique ideas. So let's take a look at these two other examples. So in this case, we started with a refrigerator, and the characters are going to be vegetables, tomatoes, onions, corn, and a melon, right? So the situation we have is, what would be unique about this situation of a bunch of vegetables in the refrigerator? What if it was a jailbreak, right? So in this case, a group of vegetable criminals decide to make a jailbreak from the refrigerator. And that creates an interesting kind of backstory and conflict. So they're vegetables that are on death row, so they're in the fridge, and they've all gone bad, quote unquote, because they're about to expire and be thrown out, right? And so the cook or the owner of the refrigerator is the executioner. So they need to make an escape before they are sentenced to death, essentially, right? And so that already is a pretty interesting concept and a lot we can work with, right? It inspires some unique character designs and character personalities. It's a weird setting to look at watch a movie in, and this types of situations and obstacles they might run into can be really fun. This one is just pulled from Shrek, right? It's just a distillation of what Shrek is, right? So we have a character who's a knight, but they are an ogre knight, right? Not something you're used to. So a fairy tale medieval country, right? So in this case, fairy tale, because we're working with ogres, it's a big part of the film is creating this in a fairy tale medieval country. Gives us a lot of gags in the movie of, fairies and Rumpelstiltskin and all these other classical fairy tale creatures. In this case, the ogre wants to save his swamp, right? And so we have this conflict of the king promises to return a swamp if he saves the princess from the dragon, right? So that informs this character and what he wants, informs us of what the main conflict in the storyline is going to be. In this case, he has a motivation of saving a swamp, and we've identified that he's going to be a knight. So what do? We pair that motivation he has with his occupation, which is being a knight, so he has to save a princess from a dragon. I wholeheartedly encourage you guys, just from the very beginning, you guys don't have to have a perfect story before you start drawing, but just start drawing. Even if you aren't great at drawing, just start drawing. If you also aren't great at drawing, start looking at references and pulling reference images in just to give people visual ideas of what you're thinking of. By doing sketches, and especially by doing a lot of sketches, it's kind of like coming up with stories and doing revisions on your story ideas, right? You're going to start with the obvious, and then you're going to find ideas by doing a revision or a remix, right? So in this case, we have the marriage of two shepherds, right? And so they're in the drawing, we have a sheepdog and a sheep in attendance. And so the next drawing might be, okay, how do we make this different or unique? What if instead it's the two sheep are actually going to get married, right? And the shepherd is in attendance at the wedding, right? So that's a little bit different, a little less expected. And then we have other elements like, oh, whoa, what if the sheep actually married a wolf or married the sheepdog, right? And so that by drawing these out and finding new elements, just by drawing that first drawing and drawing in the sheepdog and the sheep, could give you inspiration of new ways you might want to take your project. Especially if you guys really like drawing, definitely do this. It can give you a lot of really cool ideas. I know in my classes, we've had story reviews where just a person showing a certain drawing inspired all kinds of new ideas from people who were giving them feedback. And then that ended up motivating their final story where they're like, oh, wow, that is a good idea. I didn't think about it. I just drew that character because I thought they were fun. And everybody else kind of found new ideas and inspiration from what they were doing. So now we come to the less fun part about coming up with the stories for, especially for group projects in a class, is once you have a really solid ideas, or even if you have a pool of solid ideas you want to pare down, you need to start looking at some of these other components to help you make your decisions. So ideally, we'd go for just the straight best story, but at the same time, we have to be realistic of what we can do, especially within a single semester. So what you want to do is you want to look at your technical feasibility. So you want to look at, is it technically possible to do? Do we have the resources and do we even have the knowledge to pull off something like this? So if you wanted to shoot a film or make a film that is in a cavern full of like crystals and really complex rendered objects, right? Do we have the resources to do that? Probably not. And it's probably way too expensive to render. And it's going to be really hard and essentially give us a headache during the semester. So maybe that story or that environment isn't what we want to tell because it's just going to be too hard for us at this moment. Artistic considerations. If you guys don't feel passionately about the idea from the beginning, then you guys definitely aren't going to still feel passionate about it at the end, right? So it needs to be a story that everybody on the team kind of buys in on and at least enjoys and is going to be satisfied with. If nobody in the team really cares about it that much, like if you're making a story about a walking and talking beaver, but no one on the team is particularly interested in designing a beaver or animating a beaver or modeling a beaver, and it's like, fine, we'll do it for the project, then that's probably, again, like a terrible character to have in your short film. So it's a good idea to meet with your team and talk amongst your teams and ask yourselves, what do you want to work on, right? And what is our story going to give us to work on during the semester? So if you really wanted to work on like let's say 2 or 3 of your teammates are like, oh, I really want to work on a walking character that's an animal, right? Then that's probably a pretty good motivation that you guys maybe do want to actually have an animal character in your story. And that can give you a lot of information of what you want to aim for. Ambition. So sometimes stories are just too ambitious for your team. So again, this comes back to technical feasibility, but think about the amount of time that it's going to take. Realistically, you guys have, if you're taking my studio class, only 4 months to finish the project, and you're going from the start to the finish of the entire pipeline of creating an animated short. So things like, does a character have fur? Do we have like an insane amount of environments or characters, right? Do we have an insane amount of effects, right? Those are all things that you guys are going to have to work on. So you really need to pare it down and work together to think about what's actually it's going to take to create a particular story. You can still have the same story and tell that story, but you can be a little less ambitious sometimes and find ways that you can cut corners. And that's encouraged in my class, especially of cutting corners in the production stage so you guys can tell your story more efficiently. So in summary, these are the things I want you guys to keep in mind. Story elements are more important than your production elements. I say that with a big caveat. So when we're talking about the VFX movie and animation industry, and you're working in one of these big studios, yes, that is the ultimate goal if you're going to be on the story team, is that the story is more important than the individual elements that are going to be in it, right? You don't tell a story that is just about, includes a witch just because you think a witch would look cool. It has to have a really important motivation or purpose in the story itself. Now, the big caveat I have is that this does not apply necessarily to my classes in undergraduate school or even graduate school. I recommend that you guys do think about your production elements and in some cases actually tailor your story based on your production elements. So like I was saying before about technical feasibility and doing what's possible within like not being too ambitious, this is where you don't want to be too ambitious. So you should be thinking about what do we want to work on and where do we want to like what do we think we can do in this short period of time and make our story kind of based on that. On that note, don't bite off more than you can chew. So like I said, don't go too ambitious. Don't Think about your like what's technically feasible, what you guys can do, what you guys have the skills for, being honest with your team, and then what you guys are interested in working on. In your story, try to find something that's an original. Find something that it hasn't really been done before or told before, or even if you're telling the same story, tell it in a unique way or from a unique perspective or in a unique environment. And lastly, you guys have to like your film, because if you guys don't like your film, no one else will. We'll give you feedback. Your classmates will give you feedback. Your friends and partners will give you feedback. But if you don't like what their feedback is in terms of it ends up with a film that you're not really happy with, then you're not going to make a film that is filled with passion and you're not going to finish it and enjoy it. That's not to say don't take feedback and don't listen to what we're saying, because people have very insightful comments into if your story is actually going to be successful or if it's something that people want to watch. But don't let it turn into something that you guys are going to hate working on. So here's some of the resources that I was pulling from. These are great books that I recommend if you guys are interested in the story creation process and later on in the storyboarding process. So these are all have notes from professionals and people who have been experienced in the film or in the film industry about how to the process of creating storyboards and stories for film and animation.